Hi everyone, it's Caroline. Let's just go ahead and get this out of the way right at the very beginning here. I hate YA fantasy. I also love YA fantasy, and therein lies the whole concept for today's video. I admittedly haven't read a whole lot from the genre itself, but what I have read from it, my feelings either end up going one of two ways. The first way is that I love it and it becomes one of my favorite books of all time. I get borderline obsessed. I change my whole personality based on it, you know, the whole nine. Or it goes the complete opposite way, where I want to DNF it. I hate it with every fiber of my being, get in book hangovers and book slumps, reading slumps because of it. And because of that, it leaves me with the dilemma in that I am constantly chasing the high of wanting to read books from the YA fantasy genre because they could turn out to be a new favorite, but then I'm constantly being pulled back because I'm worried that I might pick up a book from the genre that I read and then end up hating and feel like I've wasted my time. I haven't read widely enough within the genre to know what it is that I definitively like and definitively don't like, so I don't know what to look for and I don't know what to pick up. So the whole concept and the whole point of today's video is to read books within the YA fantasy genre that will help me figure out my tastes and preferences within this specific brand of books. Before I tell you what books I plan on reading throughout this video, I thought that it would be helpful for me to tell you some examples of books that I've read within the genre that I've loved, and then books that I've read within the genre that I have not loved. Here are some examples of young adult fantasy books that I've read in the past that I have truly loved. If you asked me to make like a top 20 list of all time of books that I've read, these three would probably end up somewhere on that list. And it's super difficult because looking at these books and trying to find anything that they have in common, I kind of come up empty. I'm not necessarily super well versed on fantasy tropes and like sub-genres, but even me, someone who hasn't read broadly within the fantasy genre, knows that these probably don't fall within the same sub-categories of the fantasy umbrella. I would say that all three of them probably are pretty mainstream or popular within the YA fantasy genre. If I try really, really hard, there are some things that maybe all three of them, or at least two of them, have in common with one another. I would say that all three definitely have some found family aspect. Found family trope isn't necessarily something that I like just when it's included in fantasy or young adult fantasy. That's a trope that I enjoy across genres. Both Children of Blood and Bone and Strange the Dreamer have some type of dream magic or dreamscape sequences, and I can definitively say that that's something that I really loved and enjoyed about each of them. And then one thing that I kind of didn't realize until just now is that all three of them have some sort of alternate perspective or alternating viewpoints within them. So hopefully that gives you some kind of idea or perspective of at least young adult fantasy books that I've read before and have enjoyed. And then for duality's sake, I guess, here are some examples of young adult fantasy books that I have read and I have not loved at all. Again, just like with the fantasy books or the YA fantasy books that I read and loved, it's really hard to look at these and see if they have anything in common, except, oh my gosh, they all have crowns on the cover. So we figured it out. I don't even have to do the rest of the video. If a YA fantasy book has a crown on the cover, I'm not gonna like it. But in actual seriousness, I just like the YA fantasy that I've loved, I would say that all three of these are fairly popular or mainstream. To be honest, I think that my main issue with all three of these, or at least any of the YA fantasy that I've read, is that I am perpetuating the stereotype of a adult woman who reads YA and then ends up not liking it because it wasn't written for my intended age range or audience. However, as we already know, that can't be the sole reason why I don't like it, because I just showed you a bunch of examples of young adult fantasy that I have read as not a young adult person and really loved and enjoyed. I think that one emotion that I had when reading the majority of these stories, that I either was really bored or really confused, either because the world was too convoluted or I couldn't get invested in the characters, their dialogue wasn't clicking. And then hopefully you see my problem. Just like with the YA fantasy that I've loved, these 3 books don't necessarily have anything in common in terms of YA fantasy tropes or subsects. So now that I've told you some examples of YA fantasy that I have loved and YA fantasy that I have not loved, and at least tried to explain why I think I loved the YA fantasy that I did and then why I didn't love the YA fantasy that I didn't, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you the books that I'm going to be reading in this video, and then kind of why I picked those books based on what I've already read within the genre. All of these books that I'm about to mention were already on my radar or like TBR for some reason or another. I'm sure if I really wanted to, I could have done a deep dive and like typed into Google found family, non-cross-world fantasy and gotten recommendations that way, but I wanted to pick from books that I was already interested in. So the first book that I'm going to be reading to try and figure out my YA fantasy preferences is The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. I picked this one up because I'm pretty sure whenever I hear this book talked about or whenever I hear this book pitched, one of the first phrases that is said or written is found family. I think that this is like the blueprint for a lot of YA fantasy found family. And then I could be wrong, but I think that the magic that exists within this has to do with dreams in some way, shape, or form. I'm not exactly sure, but for those 2 reasons, that's why I picked this book to read. Next YA fantasy book that I plan to read in this video is We Hunt the Flame by Hafsah Faizal. This one, I'm gonna be honest, I picked out because I have a friend who I know knows my reading tastes and preferences, and she has said that I'm really going to love this. So that's kind of the big reason that I'm putting this on there. But also another reason is because it's kind of reminiscent of something that I loved in Children of Blood and Bone, where there's 2 characters that are kind of hunting a common object, but they're also enemies, so they're kind of hunting each other at the same time. And I think that we may get kind of alternating perspectives or viewpoints in this one as well. And the third and final YA fantasy that I'm going to be reading for this video is actually a book that hasn't been released yet. I have it as an e-arc through NetGalley, and it is Small Favors by Erin A. Craig. There's no real reason in particular why I think that I'm going to like this. The cover is stunning to me. Also, I've heard that it's kind of like a twisted wish fulfillment that's a part of the story somehow. So I know that I talked about earlier, like kind of dreamscapes or magic or dream sequences being something that I think that I like within the YA fantasy genre, and to me, dreams and wishes kind of go hand in hand. So we'll see, maybe we'll get that, but maybe we won't get that at all. So there you have it, that's the concept for today's video. I'm trying to figure out my preferences within the YA fantasy genre. I think that I've picked books wisely, but we also never know, because if it's not already apparent, I don't actually know what my preferences are. That's what the point of this video is. So I hope that you'll have a lot of fun following along. I think that I'm going to start with The Raven Boys just because I have a physical copy of it. I hope that this introduction wasn't too convoluted. It has to be better than the one that I tried to film earlier. Okay, I can do it. This is fine. Hi everyone, welcome to my facial mask beard. This is no way to intro clip a vlog. Yeah, hopefully this makes sense. Trying to figure out my preferences within the YA fantasy genre. Nervous because I'm worried that I'll hate these books, but also excited because I might find some new favorites. recommendation for anyone who has similar bubbly water preferences to me, where when you are consuming sparkling or bubbly water, I want the bubbles so crisp that when I drink it, it's almost like the sensation of tiny little knives cutting my tongue. Blue sparkling water from Oasis. I don't know what regions of the world it's available in, but oh, there is not a crispier, sharper bubble out there. This is the lemon mint. I definitely thought that was gonna be cooler, but can you see those bubbles? Oh, there's nothing better. Moving on from sharp, crispy, bubbly water. Last night I got about 80 pages into the Raven Boys, and I felt the need to update just because I can already hear people screaming at me. Have you been screaming at me through your screen? I do not blame you, because the whole point of this was to read books that fall under the YA fantasy genre, and this, at least so far, is not fantasy. I mean, I guess it really depends on how big your YA fantasy umbrella is, because if it's super big and super inclusive, this might fall under it. But so far, nothing super fantastical has happened. But I don't want to stop reading it because I'm actually really enjoying it. Let me try to talk my way through this and make myself feel better about not Xing this from this vlog, because there are some light fantastical things that have happened. One of the main characters, the girl main character, Blue, she comes from this family of witchy women. They like read tarot and they have sight, like they can see into the future. It's not always clear, but they can like predict deaths and see not super clear things. She doesn't have that gift. Her presence like amplifies other people's abilities. That's a little bit magical. We can count that. And then on the opposite side, there is this group of teenage boys that go to this super elite academy, and I think that they have all been drawn or brought together because they have this interest in something called, I think it's called a ley line, which I still don't entirely understand what that is. This book is already doing that thing that I brought up in my intro clip, where there's kind of these alternating perspectives between Blue and what's going on with her, and then the boys and what's going on with them. Oh, and then okay, so this is what I love. This is why I love that, because Blue and, I don't want to spoil anything. I don't know what is a spoiler and what isn't. But all I'll say, in case you truly don't want to know anything, Blue and Gansey kind of have this connection, and right around the 80 page mark is when they first met, but they were unaware who the other person was. And so like just the, what do you call that? The dramatic irony where like I as the audience knew the connection between the two of them, but they hadn't realized the connection yet. So it was just me screaming. But I'm nervous because the whole reason why, I don't even know if this is necessary, but I'm just gonna tell you, I'm nervous because Gansey and Blue have this connection, but Gansey approached Blue because Gansey's friend Adam was interested in Blue. And so far, Adam is my favorite one of the boys. I just think he's so soft and he cares about his friends so deeply, and I can already tell that if anything remotely bad happens to him, I am going to riot. I'll try to update you when I have something that I feel is worthwhile updating you on. Okay, bye. Okay, hello. I'm about 200 pages into the Raven Boys, so we're about halfway through, and I have forsaken every single responsibility that I've had to do today. I had to do so much, and I've done basically none of it because I cannot stop reading this stupid book. I am obsessed. So I can't even give you an update right now beyond that because I just can't be bothered to stop reading this thing. So in place of a midway update, I thought that we could just like hang out and read. What is happening? Okay, I've finished The Raven Boys. I actually finished like hours ago, and I haven't been able to get anything done today because as soon as I start a task, I find myself not even like 5 minutes later just zoning out and replaying scenes from this book on a loop in my head. So I think that it's safe to say that I have figured out or found another YA fantasy that I can add to my list of YA fantasy that I have absolutely loved. Although I still hesitate to even refer to this as fantasy, I'm sure that some people wouldn't. I guess it just depends on how strict you want to define the fantasy genre in your head. But I get, like, what else would you categorize this under? Because it's definitely not, like, I wouldn't put it under contemporary. It's not a YA contemporary. Maybe like dark academia. I don't even know what dark academia is. Is this it? Looking at the reasons why I went in to read this in the first place, I wanted found family, which we definitely got with that. All these boys are so deeply invested in one another's lives that to the point where when any of them makes even the most minor of decisions, all the other boys have the most like visceral and hyperbolic reactions, and it's probably unhealthy, and I probably shouldn't be as obsessed with them as I am, but here we find ourselves. There's this one scene with Adam and Gansey that happens towards the end in a Camaro, and I almost did not make it through that scene, I'm telling you. So found family, check. Definitely a preference I have in all genres really, but I think that there's something in particular that works well in YA fantasy. And then I think the last thing on that list was that I thought that there was some kind of dream magic in here, or dreamscape sequences, and that was not the case, although the very last line of this has me thinking that maybe in future books in the series that could happen. And then one thing that I was thinking about in terms of magic when it comes to YA fantasy, and we're talking about my preferences, is that there were definitely parts in here where the magic confused me. Like, I didn't understand what was going on. I was trying to think about why it didn't bother me in here, whereas it may have bothered me in other YA fantasy, and the conclusion that I have come to is that I don't think that I am the person who loves super structured magic systems and settings when it comes to my fantasy. I think that I would much rather have something like this where it's unexplained. So now I've realized that I haven't left my apartment in like 48 hours, so I'm going to run to the beach for a hot minute, a literal hot minute, because I know that it's going to be way too hot outside to be at the beach, but I'm hoping that by the time I get there, the sun will be going down. And I'm going to be bringing my, I don't have it with me, I'm going to be bringing my e-reader with me so I could read Small Favors by Erin A. Craig. Just a quick synopsis before I dive into it. It takes place in this fictional mountainside town. People start disappearing from the town, and so the townspeople obviously get more and more amped up and more scared. And I think somehow also there's this group in the town that's a little bit culty. I don't know, that like grant wishes or favors, hence the title, but they make whoever they grant those favors to give something back. I do tend to love a small town setting. I also love twisted wish fulfillment, or at least in my mind I do. I can't bring up any examples right now of books I've read that have had this, but in my head I think that I'm gonna like that. Then I also think that there's just something that's great for tension in fantasy when people keep disappearing and there's a mystery as to like, is it a human that's causing the disappearances, or is it something more than that? So I'm gonna go to the beach and I'll update you when I can tell you if any of those things actually happen in this book. Hi, it's not even 60 seconds later, but I found my e-reader and I was just standing here like swiping through so I could, when I get to the beach, I could just be on the first chapter where I needed to start reading. And this book is broken into parts and it's separated by season. So there's like winter, fall, but the first part is called Indian Summer. And I don't love that. Hello, it has been quite a few days, and it would have been less than quite a few days because I could have sworn that I filmed a clip updating you on my progress for Small Favors by Erin A. Craig, but either I'm losing my mind, well no, either way I'm losing my mind, but either A, I'm losing my mind and I never actually filmed it, I just like thought through what I was gonna say and then never actually hit record, or B, I'm losing my mind and I did film it and I somehow deleted it or it's lost on my computer somewhere. Either way, it's gone, it doesn't exist anymore. But I'm done with the book, and if I was worried about qualifying The Raven Boys as YA fantasy, listen, if I'm counting this as YA fantasy, The Raven Boys is 100% YA fantasy, because this, it says that it's, I think in the description it says that it's a twisted fairy tale, but this, for me, read more like a YA horror novel masquerading as a twisted fairy tale. It gave me the vibes of like The Crucible plus The Village, that movie from M. Night Shyamalan. Those two things combined. Pretty much the entirety of the synopsis that I told to you happens within like the first 25% of the plot. So it takes place in this super small village that is heavily surrounded by woods, and the people of the village are very fearful of the woods. They have this like list of town rules, and I think like the #1 rule is don't go into the woods alone. And so right off the bat, there's this hunting kind of supply party of people from the village that go missing, they don't come back. A couple of people from the village that go out looking for them, and what they find is the remains of this supply hunting party, and it's just a giant bloodbath. Then the question arises of like, is it humans? Is it animals? Or is it something more? There's so many things in this village that just begin to go wrong. Animals, like these horses, are born with their spines on the outside of their body, or like one was born with their eyes fused shut. These like teenage boys from the village that were hunting in the woods, and they bring back this elk that is just all wrong. It's like growing a 5th leg, and instead of a hoof, there's talons, and like the antlers on the elk's face, instead of growing like out from the top of its head, are growing like all from around its face and like tangled up in front of its head. Like, I'm gonna have images in my head for years to come. So much of this book, which I was not anticipating, is a survival story. There's weather things that begin to happen, like really, really dry springs and summers with no rains, or extremely long winters with these heavy, heavy snowstorms. So basically the people of the village have to like hunker down and ration. And then when they're hunkered down for the winter time is when the people of the village, their minds kind of start to do what the animals' bodies are doing or what the land is doing. But I mean, that's pretty much it for a good 75 to 80% of the book. We're just watching this village descend into chaos. There were so many things in here that really, really worked for me personally, like with my overall reading tastes and preferences. One, super slow plot, like the slowest slow burn plot that you can imagine. But for me, it was slow in a way that the pace was also cadenced really well. And then also, this book does my favorite thing, where it's a mystery, where a bunch of mysterious stuff keeps happening, but no one is actually trying to actively solve the mystery. It's told from the main character's first-person perspective, so it's very much just like, I couldn't ever really get wholly invested in any of the characters just because it's very much skewed from her angle. I personally, in my fantasy especially, I need to get overly invested and attached to characters, and at no point did that really happen, but I also don't think that that was the intention of the author. When I was reading The Raven Boys, Maggie Stiefvater's writing matched the tone and atmosphere of that book so perfectly. And it's not that the writing was bad in this book, it's just it was very straightforward, and I would have liked to see, I guess, the tone match the atmosphere of the setting a little bit more. I would have really loved to see that, especially in my fantasy. I think that's something I like, is semi-atmospheric writing. So small favors in terms of this experiment of finding out my tastes and preferences of YA fantasy. I think with this one we have kind of an anomaly, because like I said at the beginning of the video, normally with YA fantasy, I either love it and lose my mind over it, or I absolutely hate it. And this fell somewhere in the middle, probably more towards love. I had a really good, solid reading experience with it, and like I said, there's some stuff that's going to stick with me, like in my chest and in my head, for a long time. My last book is going to be We Hunt the Flame, where I think it, at least definitely compared to the other two that I've read so far, has some of the strictest worlds and rules and systems. From my understanding, this is an Arabian inspired fantasy, and we get kind of two characters that we're following. One of them is this girl who's trying to save her people, and then the other one is this like dark, this prince of death, and both of them are kind of hunting, I think, this same artifact, but they're like on opposing sides somehow. And so while they're hunting this artifact separately, they're kind of also aware of one another and like are out to kill one another at the same time. See, this is what I'm talking about. Like, this one has a map at the beginning, although maybe the Raven Boys had a map at the beginning too. No map at the beginning, just a quote from Edgar Allan Poe. See, this is what I mean in like, this one is the most straightforward fantasy. Is that the word that I want to use? I don't even know why I'm saying that. I'm like, it has a map at the beginning, so it must be like a good example of YA fantasy. Oh look, it's written in acts as well. Marhaba. It says marhaba. That's so exciting. I should have maybe guessed, because this is, I knew it was like an Arabian inspired fantasy, that there might be some Arabic words and phrases throughout here. That's exciting. Not that I know, why am I pretending I don't know Arabic. The extent of my Arabic is marhaba. This one I think is the one that I'm definitely the most nervous going into. I just really, really hope that my tiny, tiny brain can comprehend what's going on in here. But I'm gonna go in with a good attitude, and I promise that I will be better at updating this time. Okay, I am holding up to my end of the bargain, and this is me doing my official mid-book check-in. First one of this vlog, even though we're on the last book. We're not gonna talk about that. We're also not gonna talk about the fact that technically this isn't an exact midpoint check-in, because at this point I'm this far in, which was not the case this morning. I brought this to school with me today, and during my prep or like my planning period, instead of doing my job, I read over to the over halfway point in this. So I had good intentions of checking in halfway, but I didn't. But we're here now, so we're all just gonna forgive each other. But I'm realizing that I don't actually remember what I talked about at the beginning check-in with this book. Like, I don't necessarily know if I said anything about why I chose this book, or like why I thought that I might like it. Regardless of whether or not that happened, I do have some things that I can update you on. One is that I think I said this before, this, out of all 3 books that I've read in this video so far, this is for sure the highest fantasy, most fantastical setting of all of them, I guess. And like, please know to not take me seriously. Like, I don't actually know what high fantasy means. The things that this book has done so far that are confirming things that I think, that preferences that I have with YA fantasy. So this book does that thing. I don't know if I'm gonna even say this correctly, but where we have 2 kind of characters that we're following, and it's not even necessarily like it like switches chapter by chapter perspectives. Like a lot of times with YA fantasy, when they have like character shift perspectives, the names of the chapters will be like the name of the character whose perspective we're getting, and we don't necessarily get that. But like, so at the beginning of the book, we have our main character Zafira, and there's stuff that's going on with her and like in her village. And then we have Nasser, and we're following him around and like his life at the palace and blah, blah, blah. And they are unaware of each other, but like we get the hint that they're going to be aware of each other. So like we as the audience know, but they don't know yet. And it's kind of following them as their paths wind closer and closer and closer. And I can 100% confirm that I love that so much. I think that it creates the best kind of tension, because I flew through the first like 200 pages of this. One, because I go so hard for these characters, which we'll talk about in a second, but 2, because I was just like, okay, when are they gonna, like, I need to get, when are they gonna meet, when are they gonna see each other, like what is their first interaction gonna be like? And so I just tore through those first 200 pages, and I'm trying to think, like, I think I might have said when I was reading The Raven Boys that kind of happened, which it did. It just didn't get quite as drawn out. Like the tension didn't have as much time to build, because like just Blue and Gansey kind of met sooner than the main characters did in here. And you know what else that I just thought of right now? Another YA fantasy where that happens is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, which I'm pretty sure I put at the beginning, or I will have put at the beginning of like YA fantasy books that I've already read and loved. So that, like, I feel like that's official thumbs up. That's something that I love in YA fantasy in particular. Another thing that I don't think I was aware of at the beginning when I started reading this, maybe I was, but like, we get found family in here. We don't get it until like over the halfway point, but I already am dying. Like, the banter between these characters is unparalleled, and I like am screaming laughing at a book. Like, I will be completely 100% by myself, screaming, laughing. Particularly if you've read this before, Nasser and the general, what's his, I'm not gonna remember his name, hold on. Nasser and Altair, oh my gosh, their dynamic and relationship, I cry laughing. So good, so good. So I realize I haven't really mentioned a whole lot about like what this book is about or like what's going on in this book, and that's by design, because I'm gonna be honest, I still don't know what's going on in this book. The history of magic, and there's like all these different lands, and there's like political stuff going on, and I don't understand hardly any of it. I understand like the broader overarching part of it, but I think this is definitely, unlike the other two I've read in this video so far, this is definitely one where you're kind of supposed to be keeping up, or at least the author intends for you to be keeping up with like the backstory and the world itself and like the conflict, and I'm not. But that 1000% does not even matter to me, because these characters are everything. I love them so much. So I don't know how helpful any of this has been if you're like actually interested in reading this book, but hopefully, maybe in the 9 minutes that I've been talking already, I've been able to either confirm or deny some of the tastes and preferences that I've had in YA fantasy, because I feel like a lot of what we've talked about already is my preferences for kind of unexplained magic, which I think still holds true. And even though I'm reading a book where there's a lot of structures and systems in place, there's things in here like the kind of perspective shifts winding closer together, the found family, the fantastic characters that are really doing it for me. I think I've said enough, and the next time I see you, I mean, unless I have any burning desire to update you before then, which never say never, maybe I will. But if not, the next time I see you, I will be done with this magnificence. Okay, bye. Okay, I had to bring this out, because out of all the things that I thought that this book would make me do, I did not think that making me cry would be one of them. And I'm not, I guess that's dramatic. I'm not like, tears haven't fallen, but they are like right here, and it has to do, like, no spoilers, but it has to do with a tattoo and what the words mean, and how a certain person understands what it means, but the other person doesn't know that that person understands, and it's a lot, and I don't know what's wrong with me. Okay, I'm so sorry. I know that I said that the next time that I checked in, I would be done, and I'm not done yet, but I just feel like I need to update you all that I just read a plot twist that made me fall from this point right here where I was reading onto my floor. And like, I'm like a fairly dramatic person, but I am completely on my own. So I fell to the floor of my own volition because, oh my God. Oh my God. I'm freaking out. I'm freaking out. In a shocking turn of events, this was my favorite book that I read throughout this whole entire video. This may be my favorite book that I've read all year. So all of this speculation talk that I've been doing about how I think in my YA fantasy preferences, I prefer to read about unstructured or like non-strict kind of magic or magic systems or not as high fantasy. This just completely disproved that, because this book has all of those things and it's my favorite one that I've read in this video. I have now edited all the footage in this video up until this point, and I realized that one thing that I didn't do was give you my star rating for any of these books, which I'm kind of just thinking about giving up star rating altogether, but that's a different video conversation for a different time. But I'm gonna go ahead and give you my star ratings now, or at least what I think they are. And like, in watching this video footage back for like my reactions for this, and even just thinking about how it's been a few days since I finished this and I'm still just reveling in this book's absolute glory, this has to be 5 stars. Like there's no way that this isn't a 5-star book, which probably puts the Raven Boys, at somewhere between like a 4 and 5 stars probably. And then Small Favors, I'm just gonna use my iPad as a stand-in. Small Favors is probably somewhere, like if this is a 5 and this is between a 4 and a 5, then Small Favors is probably somewhere between a 3 and a 4, closer to a 4. So that's my ranking. This whole video experience process went kind of differently than I thought that it was going to go when I got the idea for this video and then actually started filming this video. Because at the beginning, what I thought that I knew about my YA fantasy tastes and preferences was that with YA fantasy, I was either going to absolutely love the book or absolutely hate the book. And as we can see here, my reading experience for all of these just disproved that, because I read 3 YA fantasy books. I at least had a moderately enjoyable, if not extremely enjoyable reading experience for all 3 of them. So what I kind of thought was going to happen was that I was going to be able to read these different books from different types of YA fantasy and then maybe discover specific YA fantasy tropes or styles that I really didn't like, and that didn't happen. And then I thought on the opposite end, I would be able to discover YA fantasy tropes and styles that I really did like. And that kind of also didn't happen, because like in here, the fantasy part is like the witchy and kind of ghosty magic that goes on. And while I enjoyed reading about it in this book, I don't know that that particular thing is something I would want to read about in another YA fantasy book. Or like with this one, we have kind of a quest-based plot line in this gorgeous kind of desert kingdom setting. And while I clearly loved reading about those things in here, I don't know that it would cause me to pick up another book with those same kinds of things. What I think ended up happening in my experience with this experiment of figuring out my tastes and preferences with YA fantasy is that I discovered more general tropes and general stylistic things that could be applied to any genre, but I really, really love it when it's applied to the fantasy or YA fantasy genre. These 2 definitely showed me that I love a found family. These 2 also kind of showed me that I really love when we get multiple character perspectives or viewpoints, and bonus points if there's perspectives that are separate kind of at the beginning of the book, but then the characters or the groups of characters kind of spiral closer and closer to each other as the plot goes on, and then they eventually meet. And then with these 2, I think that it still stands true that I will kind of search for and seek out fantasy or YA fantasy that has unexplained magic or magic systems. So when I sat down to film this kind of end update, I was kind of a little bit frustrated because I was like, I'm not gonna have anything to tell them. Like I didn't discover specific fantasy or YA fantasy things that I can tell them about, but I was able to more narrow down and figure out my tastes and preferences than I had figured out before I started filming this and embarking on this reading experience. So I'm calling this a success. I hope that this was an enjoyable watching experience. Thank you so much for sticking around. And if it wasn't clear, I recommend every single one of these. Small Favors, I think, is released in June. So check that release date out. And I'm just so happy that you're still here, and I appreciate you so much. Now that you know my kind of tastes and preferences within the YA fantasy genre, please give me recommendations. Another reason, really quick before I go, that I'm calling this a success is because I now have 2 YA fantasy series. This is a duology, I'm pretty sure, and this is some type of series. I don't know how many books there are in this, that I can embark on further in my YA fantasy journey. But if you have recommendations that you think fit any of the preferences that I discovered that I had throughout this video, please let me know. I would love to read them. I would love to put them on my radar. And as always, thank you so, so much for watching. I appreciate you so much, and I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you again very, very, very soon. Goodbye.